An orphaned little boy hands a soldier a folded letter at the airport. "Hey sir, can you take this to my dad? He's in heaven with your friends." The soldier, a solitary, hardened man, tries to ignore the request before taking a closer look at the boy's face, and freezing in shock. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you're watching us from, and please like this video to support the channel. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. Jack Hayes sank deeper into the plastic airport chair, shoulders tense and eyes fixed on nothing in particular. The terminal buzzed with holiday chaos, kids dragging glittering backpacks, parents balancing coffee cups and toddlers, announcements cutting through the noise like static-laced knives. Jack adjusted the duffel bag at his feet, the one that still smelled faintly of sand and gun oil, and pulled the cap lower over his brow. 2 more hours to kill before his flight, 2 more hours of pretending he wasn't alone in a sea of families heading home. He would have given anything to cancel it and stay in his apartment, with a glass of scotch and the silence of his thoughts. He tapped his boot against the scuffed floor, jaw clenched tight. Just another Christmas alone. Better that way. "Hey, sir?" The voice was small, careful. Jack glanced sideways and nearly did a double take. A little boy stood there, brown hair sticking out from under a too big beanie, clutching a folded piece of paper in one gloved hand. The kid couldn't have been more than 8, maybe 9, with cheeks still pink from the cold outside. "Yeah?" Jack grunted, half a mind to send him back to wherever his parents were. The kid took a shaky breath, shoes scuffing against the floor as he shifted his weight. "Can you take this to my dad?" He held out the paper, hands trembling a little. "He's in heaven with your friends." Jack stared, words sticking in his throat. The kid's eyes, there was something about them. A shade of blue that twisted Jack's insides, a shade that he hadn't seen in years. Charlie's eyes. The duffel bag strap dug into Jack's palm. His mouth opened and closed once, twice. He almost blurted something, an apology, a question, anything, but the kid's shoulders sagged before he could figure out what to say. "Never mind," the boy mumbled, cheeks flushing with embarrassment. He pulled the letter back, crumpling the edge a little, and started to turn away. "Wait," Jack said, rougher than intended. The boy stopped, eyes wide. Jack cleared his throat, let out a breath through his nose. "Where's your mom?" The kid bit his lip, gaze dropping to his shoes. "She's not here," he muttered. "She's in heaven too." Jack's stomach twisted. He rubbed a hand over his jaw, glancing around the terminal. No one seemed to notice or care. He looked back at the kid, Oliver. He said his name was, voice barely above a whisper. No mom. No dad. Just a kid with a letter too big for his hands and eyes that didn't belong in a face so young. "Who are you here with then?" Jack asked, trying to keep his tone even. "The director from the orphanage dropped me off," Oliver said, wiping his nose on his sleeve. "She had to go back, but I know the way." Jack's fingers flexed against the strap of his bag. "You alone?" Oliver nodded. Jack glanced at the departure board, at the crowds milling around without a second glance for a kid standing alone in a terminal. The familiar weight of guilt settled in his chest, heavy and unwelcome. He blew out a sigh, shifting his stance. There was his excuse he had prayed for. "All right, kid," he muttered. "Come on. I'll give you a ride." Oliver's eyes brightened, lips parting in surprise. "Really?" Jack grunted, already regretting it. "Let's go before I change my mind." They trudged through the parking lot in silence, snow slush crunching under their boots. Jack unlocked the passenger door of his truck, half expecting Oliver to hesitate. But the kid scrambled in with wide eyes, boots swinging a few inches above the floor mats. The drive started quiet, just the hum of the engine and the occasional rattle of ice against the wheel wells. Jack stared straight ahead, fingers tight around the wheel. Then Oliver spoke. "Were you really a soldier?" Jack bit back a sigh. "Yeah. Did you know my dad?" Jack's knuckles whitened. "What was his name?" "Charlie." Jack closed his eyes for half a second, the road blurring at the edges. He'd known. From the moment he'd seen those eyes, he'd known. But hearing it out loud still hit like a punch to the gut. He swallowed, throat tight. "Yeah," he said, voice rough. "I knew him." Oliver's face broke into a grin, small and bright. "I knew it," he whispered, almost to himself. "I knew he was a hero." Jack's grip on the wheel tightened. He stared hard at the road, at the blurry glow of headlights cutting through the dark. "Was he?" Oliver asked, voice soft. "Was my dad a hero?" The word stuck, bitter and sharp. Jack cleared his throat, shifting in his seat. "Yeah," he managed. "He was." Oliver leaned back, shoulders relaxing. He fiddled with the hem of his sleeve, eyes drooping a little. "Thanks," he mumbled. Jack's gaze flicked sideways, catching the way Oliver's head bobbed with the rhythm of the truck. For a second, he saw Charlie instead, grinning wide and reckless, eyes bright with laughter, the memory nearly choking him. He clenched his teeth, breathing slow and even. "Get some rest, kid," he muttered. "We'll be there soon." Oliver's head lolled against the window, eyes fluttering closed. The folded letter slipped from his fingers, settling between the seats. Jack stared at it for a long moment before reaching over and tucking it back into Oliver's small hand. His fingers lingered a second too long. The guilt in his chest tightened, raw and aching. The rest of the drive passed in silence, but it didn't feel empty. Not this time. Jack's apartment was dark and quiet when he stepped inside, the kind of silence that felt heavier after the noise of the airport. He locked the door behind him, tossed his keys onto the counter, and dropped the duffel bag beside the couch. For a moment, he just stood there, hands flexing at his sides, like he was waiting for something to snap him out of whatever spell he'd fallen into. The letter was still in his jacket pocket. Jack pulled it out slowly, fingers brushing over the crinkled edges. He hesitated, then exhaled sharply and unfolded it. The handwriting was a little shaky, some words squished too close together, others trailing off the lines. The kid must have taken his time, though. There were no scribbles or crossed-out mistakes, just neat, careful letters. "Hi Dad, I miss you a lot. I've been trying to be brave like you said. School is okay, but math is still hard. I made a new friend named Lucas. He likes drawing, but I'm not very good at it. I hope that's okay. Mrs. Taylor said you were a hero. Were you really? I hope so. I want to be like you one day. I hope you're not lonely up there. I love you." Oliver Jack's hand dropped to his side, the letter crumpling slightly between his fingers. He sank down onto the edge of the couch, the cushions sagging under his weight. For a long moment, he stared at the floor, at the thin line of light creeping in from the hallway, his mind buzzing with the words on the page. He should have thrown the letter away, or at least left it where it was. This wasn't his job. But the kid's face, the way he'd looked up with so much hope, like Jack could actually do something that mattered. Jack swore under his breath and scrubbed a hand over his jaw. He didn't sleep much that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Charlie's grin, heard the jokes that didn't stop even in the middle of chaos. By morning, he was halfway through a pot of black coffee and staring at the letter again. The clock on the stove blinked 8:23, the apartment still dark and quiet. Jack glanced at the letter, then at the door, and before he could talk himself out of it, he grabbed his keys. The orphanage wasn't far, just a few blocks from the highway. The building looked like it might have been a church once, with faded red bricks and a sagging roof. Snow clung to the edges of the windows, and the sign out front hung crooked on one side. Jack parked and stared at it for a minute, debating whether to turn around and drive home. But then the door creaked open, and Oliver came skidding out, mittens flapping. Jack barely managed to catch him before he barreled straight into his leg. Oliver blinked up at him, cheeks pink, eyes wide. "You came," he breathed. Jack grunted, shifting his weight. "Yeah, well," he muttered, scratching the back of his neck. "Thought I'd make sure you got back all right." Oliver's grin stretched wide and bright, and something twisted in Jack's chest. He cleared his throat, glancing past the boy at the open door, where a few kids peeked out curiously. The orphanage was warm inside, even if the wallpaper was peeling and some of the light fixtures flickered when you walked past. Kids darted around, some tugging at Jack's sleeve with wide eyes and whispered questions about his uniform. Jack's ears burned, but he followed Oliver into a small room off the main hall, the walls plastered with crayon drawings and mismatched frames. The woman in charge, Mrs. Carter, was gray-haired and round-faced, with a smile that seemed too kind for someone trying to wrangle that many kids. She offered Jack a cup of tea that he awkwardly accepted, trying not to look as out of place as he felt. Oliver stayed close, bouncing on the balls of his feet, eyes bright with questions. "Did you really know my dad?" he asked, leaning forward so far his knees nearly bumped the table. Jack hesitated, thumb brushing over the chipped handle of the cup. "Yeah," he said finally. "We served together." The kids who'd gathered around the doorway gasped, some whispering to each other. Jack shifted, heat crawling up his neck. "It's not, he was just a good man," he mumbled, but the kids only stared harder, eyes wide. It started with one question, then two, then a dozen all at once. Did he drive a tank? Did he parachute out of planes? Did he ever fight a bear? Jack sputtered at that last one, nearly spilling his tea. But the kids' faces were so hopeful that he found himself stumbling through stories anyway, carefully edited, of course, with some exaggeration for effect. They hung on every word, gasping and grinning, and when Jack mentioned Charlie, Oliver leaned in so far he nearly toppled off the chair. "Was he really a hero?" Oliver whispered, small fingers twisting in the hem of his sleeve. Jack's throat felt tight. "Yeah," he said, voice low. "He was." Oliver's shoulders relaxed, a small smile curling at the edges of his mouth. For a second, Jack could have sworn he saw Charlie sitting there instead, grinning wide and bright. He looked away quickly, jaw clenched. Time blurred after that, the sun dipping lower outside the frosted windows. Jack kept telling himself he should leave, but every time he shifted to stand, Oliver would tug his sleeve with another question, eyes wide and hopeful. The other kids took turns climbing into his lap or demanding piggyback rides, and somehow, he didn't mind. By the time Mrs. Carter called for dinner, Jack's voice was hoarse, and his shoulders ached from carrying half the kids in the building. He scrubbed a hand over his face, grumbling about never signing up to babysit, but the kids just giggled and clung tighter. Oliver, yawning around every other word, tugged at Jack's sleeve. "Will you come back?" he asked, small and soft, like he was scared of the answer. Jack hesitated, the weight in his chest pressing tight. "We'll see," he muttered, trying to sound gruff, but Oliver's grin said he didn't believe him for a second. When Jack finally made it to his truck, the folded letter was still in his jacket pocket, warm and crinkled. He pulled it out slowly, smoothing the edges with his thumb, and stared at the neat, careful writing until the headlights of passing cars blurred the words. His hand shook a little when he folded it back up. He shoved it deep into his pocket, clenched his jaw, and gripped the wheel until his knuckles turned white. He'd go back, he told himself. Just once. To make sure the kid was okay. Then he'd leave. This wasn't his job. But the knot in his chest didn't ease, and somehow, he already knew that once wouldn't be enough. Jack didn't plan on going back to the orphanage so soon. Maybe a week later, just to make sure the kids were doing okay. But 2 days after his first visit, he found himself driving the same icy roads with a bag of groceries and a sour mood he couldn't shake. He told himself it was just to drop off supplies. The cupboards in the orphanage kitchen had been a little too bare for comfort, and Mrs. Carter's tired smile had lingered in his mind longer than it should have. But as he pulled into the gravel lot and saw Oliver's face light up in the window, Jack knew better. The door swung open before he could knock, Oliver skidding across the entryway with a grin so wide it nearly split his face in two. "You came back," he blurted, bouncing on his toes. Jack shifted the grocery bag, trying to play it cool. "Just dropping these off," he grumbled. "You kids are probably living off cold cereal and water." Oliver's giggle bubbled out bright and carefree, and Jack's ears went warm under his cap. Before he could think of something else to grumble about, Oliver had grabbed his sleeve and was tugging him inside. It was like that every time after. Jack kept telling himself each visit would be the last, but somehow a few days would pass, and he'd end up back in that drafty building with a box of hand-me-downs or a bag of fresh bread, muttering excuses that not even he believed. The kids were used to him by the third visit, and Mrs. Carter stopped trying to hide her amused smiles when he wandered in with a fresh stack of blankets. Oliver, though, stuck to him like glue. Every time Jack looked down, the kid was there, wide-eyed and chattering a mile a minute. It didn't seem to matter that Jack's replies were mostly grunts, or that his face was stuck in a permanent scowl. Oliver kept up a steady stream of questions about the army, about tanks and helicopters, about whether or not Jack had ever fought a bear with his bare hands. "Bears don't hang out in war zones," Jack muttered once, folding an armful of laundry under Mrs. Carter's amused eye. Oliver's brows pinched together. "Not even ninja bears?" Jack snorted before he could stop himself. "Not even them," he said dryly, and Oliver's giggle was so bright that Mrs. Carter actually stopped stirring the soup on the stove to look over with a grin. Jack cleared his throat and focused very hard on matching socks. The kid had a way of breaking through his defenses without even trying. The training started a few visits later. Oliver, solemn as a drill sergeant, insisted on doing push-ups every morning in the main hall, his hands slipping on the scratched hardwood as he grunted with effort. Some of the other kids joined in, a few collapsing after 2 push-ups, while Oliver held out until his arms shook. Jack leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, mouth twitching at the corners despite himself. When Oliver flopped onto his stomach with a dramatic groan, Jack sighed and wandered over, nudging him with the toe of his boot. "You're supposed to breathe, kid," he muttered. "Unless you're trying to pass out on the floor." Oliver peeked up with wide eyes. "You do 100 push-ups every day, right?" Jack's mouth twitched again. 200, he said dryly. "While carrying a tank." Oliver's gasp was so earnest that Jack almost felt bad. Almost. "Well, I can do 3, Oliver announced proudly. Jack snorted, ruffling the kid's hair with a muttered, "Yeah, that's a start." But the look of determination on Oliver's face made something twist in his chest. By the 4th visit, the other kids were dragging Jack into makeshift forts built from old quilts and lumpy couch cushions, demanding stories about Charlie and the time they'd gotten stuck in a sandstorm or spent 3 days eating nothing but canned beans. Jack tried to keep it simple: no blood, no explosions, nothing that would get him scolded by Mrs. Carter. But the kids listened wide-eyed, interrupting with gasps and questions that Jack did his best to answer without chuckling. Oliver's favorite spot was right next to him, head resting against Jack's sleeve, eyes drooping with every story. Jack's arm would go numb from sitting so still, but he never moved until Oliver was snoring softly, curls tickling Jack's shoulder. Then he'd ease out from under the blankets, ignoring the ache in his knees, and carry Oliver back to the dormitory, careful not to jostle him awake. He always lingered for a second too long, watching the kid curl into the blankets with a soft mumble before turning back down the dark hall alone. Nights were the worst. Jack's apartment was cold and too quiet, the silence pressing down until it felt like the walls were caving in. Sleep didn't come easy, and when it did, it brought sand and smoke and screams that never dulled, no matter how many years passed. He'd wake with a start, knuckles white around the sheets, chest heaving with breaths that didn't fill his lungs. The empty apartment stared back, dark and accusing. By morning, he was always back in his truck, engine grumbling through the frosted streets, heading for the one place that didn't feel like it was suffocating him. Mrs. Carter started leaving an extra cup of tea on the counter whenever he showed up. Jack would grumble about it, but he still drank it down, warming his hands against the chipped ceramic as the kids shrieked and laughed, and Oliver tried to drag him into yet another game of tag. Every time, Jack told himself it was the last visit. That the next morning, he'd stay home and stop trying to play the hero for kids who didn't need one. But Oliver would catch sight of him at the door, face brightening like Christmas morning, and Jack's resolve would shatter before he even took his boots off. He started keeping extra blankets in his truck. Bought a set of gloves for Oliver after catching him outside with bare hands and a stubborn shiver. Taught him how to throw a decent punch after he came home with a black eye from a school bully. "Dad used to do this too," Oliver said once, glancing up from where he was trying to copy Jack's stance. His voice was small but sure, without any of the hollow ache that usually came with memories of Charlie. Jack's throat felt tight. He grunted, adjusting Oliver's elbow, and focused very hard on the cracked sidewalk instead of the warmth spreading in his chest. Days bled into weeks, the cold easing into something softer, the nightmares fading a little at a time. Jack stopped keeping track of how often he visited. He still woke in the dark sometimes, heart pounding with old memories, but the silence didn't bite as hard as it used to. Not when he could close his eyes and hear Oliver's giggle echoing in his ears, warm and bright. Snow dusted the sidewalks, thin and patchy, crunching under boots when Jack pulled up to the orphanage. Lights flickered in the windows, a crooked string of colored bulbs blinking unevenly along the roofline. Someone had tried to tape paper snowflakes to the door, but half of them were curling at the edges, threatening to drop off with the next gust of wind. Jack snorted, shaking his head as he slammed the truck door and made his way inside. The hallways buzzed with noise, kids darting back and forth with construction paper wreaths and glitter-covered ornaments. A few of the boys hollered for Jack to help untangle a ball of lights that looked more like a nest for angry squirrels than anything useful. He muttered something about needing more coffee but didn't resist when Oliver crashed into his side, face flushed with excitement. "We're making decorations," Oliver announced, holding up a lopsided paper star smudged with glue. "Mrs. Carter said we could put them up in the dining hall." "Nice," Jack grunted, inspecting the star. "Bet NASA's jealous." Oliver giggled, shoving him lightly with a grin. Jack rolled his eyes but ruffled the kid's hair anyway, steering him back down the hall with a hand on his shoulder. The noise followed them into the main room, kids squabbling over ornaments and arguing about which Christmas movie to watch first. Jack let himself settle into the chaos, tension easing from his shoulders bit by bit. He wasn't sure when this place had started feeling less like a pit stop and more like, well, something warmer. Not quite home, but close enough to keep the nightmares at bay. They were sorting through a box of tangled garland when Oliver's voice broke the comfortable silence, small and hesitant. "Hey, Jack?" "Hmm?" Jack pulled a knot free, fingers snagging on a clump of fake pine needles. "Do you think my dad was a hero?" Jack's hands stilled. He stared down at the green tinsel, throat tight. He'd known this question was coming sooner or later, but the rawness in Oliver's voice cut deeper than any knife. "Yeah," Jack said quietly. "Yeah, kid." He was. Oliver's fingers twisted in the hem of his sleeve. He stared down at the garland, shoulders hunched. Did he save a lot of people?" Jack blew out a breath, glancing at the sagging paper snowflakes and the crooked star on the tiny tree in the corner. His chest ached like a bruise, but he forced the words out anyway. "He saved me," he muttered. "That counts for something." Oliver's head snapped up, eyes wide. For a second, he just stared, mouth parting in shock. "You mean like really saved you?" "Yeah," Jack rasped, throat tight. "Like that." Oliver's eyes shone, bright and full of something that made Jack want to look away. "So, that makes you a hero too, right?" he whispered. The question was so earnest that Jack actually choked. "What? No, kid, He coughed, rubbing a hand over the back of his neck. "Listen, I just need coffee," he grumbled, retreating a step. "We're not no hero stuff." Oliver's giggle followed him all the way to the kitchen, soft and warm. That night, Jack stared at the ceiling in his dark apartment. Charlie's grin burned into the backs of his eyelids. His chest felt hollow and tight, guilt settling deep and bitter. He'd failed Charlie once already, couldn't even get through a simple question without falling apart. But maybe there was something he could do. Something small. The idea took root in the quiet, simple and unsteady but better than the ache chewing through his ribcage. Jack wasn't much for holiday cheer, but he figured even a guy like him could throw together a decent Christmas party if he tried hard enough. It started with a few boxes of cookies and a tangle of cheap string lights from the hardware store. Jack swore under his breath half the time, stringing the lights along the ceiling with one hand while Mrs. Carter watched with a smirk. Then his old army buddies got wind of it, mainly because Jack grumbled about it during their weekly calls, and decided to crash the party with bags of decorations, trays of cupcakes, and way too much eggnog. Chaos followed. Benny got tangled in a mess of lights and waddled around like a disgruntled Christmas tree, cursing under his breath until the kids collapsed in giggles. A tray of sugar cookies came out burnt to a crisp when Hank got distracted trying to teach the kids how to play poker with gumdrops. One of the older boys insisted on starting a game of charades that quickly devolved into half a dozen kids dogpiling Benny with war cries and foam swords. Jack tried to hold onto his scowl, but the kids' laughter cracked through it, bright and careless. Even Mrs. Carter hid a smile behind her mug of cocoa when Jack got dragged into charades by a trio of wide-eyed girls and had to pantomime Santa's sleigh with all the grace of a dying deer. Through it all, Oliver stuck close, eyes shining with every new tray of cookies or blinking light strand. He stayed perched at Jack's side during the movie marathon, head lolling against Jack's arm as the Grinch's heart grew 3 sizes. When the last of the kids were herded off to bed, Oliver hesitated at the bottom of the stairs, shifting his weight. "Jack?" Jack glanced over, one arm still tangled in garland. Oliver's fingers twisted in his sleeve, voice soft. "This was the best Christmas ever." Jack's throat felt tight. He grunted, clearing it with a rough cough, and rubbed a hand over the back of his neck. "Yeah, well," he muttered, "you've probably only had, 8 of 'em?" Oliver's giggle came small and warm, and he hugged Jack's arm, cheek pressed against the worn fabric of his sleeve. "Thanks," he whispered, voice barely above a breath. Jack didn't trust himself to answer. He just squeezed the kid's shoulder gently, swallowing the lump in his throat. Later, after the kids were snoring in their bunks and the lights had been dimmed to a soft glow, Jack found himself sitting at the kitchen table, a mug of cocoa cooling in his hands. Mrs. Carter bustled in with a tired but warm smile, settling across from him. "They'll remember this," she said, voice soft but sure. "You did good, Jack." Jack huffed, rubbing a hand over his face. "Just threw some lights up," he muttered. "Burn half the cookies anyway." Mrs. Carter chuckled, eyes twinkling. "Doesn't matter," she said, glancing at the worn stockings lined up by the fireplace. "You made them feel at home. That's all they wanted." Jack stared down at the cocoa, the steam curling softly in the dim light. His shoulders eased, the tension unwinding bit by bit. The nightmares stayed away that night. For the first time in a long time, he slept easy, the scent of pine and sugar cookies lingering in the dark. Jack's boots crunched through the slush as he made his way up the steps of the orphanage, arms full of model kits and paint sets. The winter air bit at his cheeks, but the glow from the windows warmed the chill a bit. It had been a week since the Christmas party, and he barely managed to shake the confetti from his jacket and the faint ache in his chest from Oliver's hug. The door creaked open before he could knock, and Oliver's face peeked out, eyes bright with surprise and something softer. "Uncle Jack!" he yelped, grinning wide enough to show the gap where a front tooth had been. Jack froze, one boot halfway over the threshold. The title hit like a sucker punch, leaving him standing dumbstruck while Oliver tugged him inside with small, eager hands. It took him a full 10 seconds to scrape together a response, muttering something about not making it a habit. But the way Oliver beamed made his chest ache, so he didn't try too hard to grumble. Somehow, the nickname stuck. The other kids caught on, then Mrs. Carter, and soon Jack couldn't cross the hall without someone hollering, "Uncle Jack!" to ask for help with math homework, or reaching the cookie jar on the top shelf. He tried to keep up the scowl, but it melted at the edges, the gruff act slipping more each day. Oliver stuck closer than anyone, shadowing Jack's every move with endless questions and an energy that never seemed to run out. The model kits became an excuse to stay late, sitting cross-legged on the threadbare carpet, paintbrushes balanced between fingers, listening to Oliver ramble about school and friends and everything in between. Jack taught him how to line up the decals and sand the edges smooth, Oliver's tongue poking out in concentration as he clumsily painted a Spitfire's wings. Jack grunted approval, but something warm and steady unfurled in his chest when Oliver's grin stretched wide. The war movies came next, old VHS tapes borrowed from Mrs. Carter's stash. Most were too heavy for the kids, so Jack stuck to the classics: fighter planes, train heists, old-school heroes who never missed a shot. Oliver crawled into his lap halfway through the second movie, eyes drooping but determined to see the ending. Jack grumbled about being used as a pillow but didn't move, even when his legs went numb. Sometimes Oliver would drift off before the credits rolled, small hands fisting the front of Jack's jacket. Jack would carry him to bed, the kid's head tucked under his chin, and linger a little too long at the door, listening to soft, steady breaths. The nightmares came a few weeks later. At first, Jack assumed they were his own, jerking awake to dark ceilings and phantom screams. But then Mrs. Carter pulled him aside, brow furrowed and voice soft. "Oliver's been having trouble sleeping," she said. "Bad dreams. He hasn't said much, but I think he's scared of losing more people." Jack's stomach twisted. He grunted something noncommittal and spent the rest of the day pretending he didn't hear Oliver's small, tired yawns or see the shadows under his eyes. That night, when Oliver's voice called soft from the bunk, "Uncle Jack?" he answered without thinking, heavy boots creaking over the wooden floor. Oliver sat huddled under a quilt, eyes wide and glassy, fingers twisted tight in the hem. Can you stay?" he mumbled. "Just for a little bit?" Jack hesitated, mouth opening to say something gruff and reassuring, but the plea in Oliver's eyes knotted his throat shut. Without a word, he lowered himself onto the edge of the bed, the mattress sagging under his weight. He stayed there until Oliver's breath evened out, the kid's fingers still clutching his sleeve. His back ached, and his neck cricked with every shift, but he didn't move, not until morning light slanted through the curtains and Oliver blinked awake, mumbling soft thanks against his sleeve. After that, it became routine. Nights bled into weeks, and Jack found himself staying late more often than not, reading stories by flashlight, grumbling through tales of dragons and knights while Oliver fought sleep with stubborn eyelids. One night, when the rest of the kids were snoring soft and the hall was quiet, Oliver's voice broke the silence, small and cracked. "I don't want to be alone," he mumbled, words muffled against Jack's sleeve. "Not forever." Jack's breath caught, hands going still over the worn pages of the book. For a moment, all he could do was stare at the cracked wallpaper and listen to the way Oliver's voice wavered at the edges. He exhaled slow, throat tight, and squeezed Oliver's shoulder. "You won't be," he muttered, voice rough but steady. "Not as long as I'm around." Oliver's fingers tightened around the quilt, breath hitching once before evening out. Jack stayed until the kid's grip slackened, eyes drooping closed, and even then he didn't move, the words echoing heavy and sure in the dark. Days bled into weeks, routine settling soft and steady. Jack showed up with groceries and left with glitter glue on his sleeves and half a dozen new drawings stuffed in his pockets. He spent late nights on the couch with Oliver curled up against his side, the soft glow of black and white films painting the walls. Once, during a grocery run, Oliver's small hand slipped into Jack's without a word. Jack's breath stuttered, throat tight, but he didn't pull away, fingers curling warm and careful around the kids. In the quiet moments, when the kids were asleep and the hall was dark, Jack found his thoughts straying to paperwork and adoption forms. He caught himself staring at the crayon drawings on the fridge, at the stack of board games piling up in the corner, at the way Oliver's face lit up whenever he stepped through the door. But every time the thought took root, guilt twisted hard and sharp, memories of Charlie's grin, of promises broken and words left unsaid. Jack shoved the idea down, buried it beneath grunts and scowls and a stubborn weight in his chest that never seemed to ease. It wasn't his job, he told himself. He'd just screw it up. The kid deserved better, deserved someone who didn't wake up gasping in the dark, fists clenched and heart pounding with old memories. But then Oliver would glance up with those bright, earnest eyes, small hand tugging at his sleeve, and Jack's resolve would shatter like glass, leaving him raw and aching and helpless to do anything but squeeze the kid's shoulder and hope it was enough. Every night the apartment felt a little colder, a little quieter. The folded letter stayed tucked in the drawer by Jack's bed, edges worn soft from too many restless nights. He'd read it 100 times, every shaky line, every hopeful word, and still, the ache never dulled. By the time spring thawed the frost from the roads, Jack had stopped pretending that he was only showing up out of guilt. The thought of adoption lingered longer each night, the idea creeping slow and steady until Jack couldn't look at Oliver's wide grin without feeling something crack in his chest. But he didn't know how to say it, didn't know if he even could. So he just stayed, night after night, reading stories and fixing broken toys, letting Oliver's small hands tug him from the dark. The news came on a Tuesday, flat and cold. Mrs. Carter pulled Jack aside after dinner, her face lined with exhaustion, fingers twisting a handkerchief over and over. The kids were still in the dining hall, scraping plates and arguing over the last of the pie, laughter echoing off the chipped tiles. Jack leaned against the wall, arms crossed, brows drawn tight. "What's going on?" he grunted, trying not to think about how Oliver had darted a grin his way just before Mrs. Carter's hand landed on his sleeve. Her mouth pulled into a thin line. "We got a letter this morning," she said, voice low and careful. "They're cutting funding. The board's talking about shutting us down by spring." Jack stared, the words hitting like a punch to the gut. His hands flexed at his sides, jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. "What?" he rasped. Mrs. Carter's shoulders slumped. "I'm trying to find a way to keep us afloat," she said softly. "Grants, donations, anything. But it's not looking good, Jack." His pulse pounded in his ears. His mind raced, tripping over the numbers and bills and the crooked stockings still hanging by the fireplace. But every thought ground to a halt at the memory of Oliver's small hand tucked in his, the kid's wide eyes and crooked grin. "No," he said, voice low and hard. "There's gotta be something else. You can't just throw them out." "I know," Mrs. Carter whispered, eyes shining with guilt. "But we don't have much time." Jack's breath came shallow, chest tight and aching. He glanced over her shoulder at the dining hall, at the kids laughing and shoving, at Oliver's bright eyes and the way he waved a fork around like a sword. Mrs. Carter squeezed his arm, voice gentle. "I just thought you should know." She slipped away with a soft sigh, leaving Jack to stare at the floor, heart pounding like a war drum. He barely tasted dinner, words sticking in his throat when Oliver asked for seconds, small fingers tapping the table impatiently. Jack forced a grin, ruffled the kid's hair, and tried to pretend his hands weren't shaking. But later, when the dishes were done and the kids shuffled off to bed, Jack found himself sitting alone at the kitchen table, head in his hands, breaths coming slow and uneven. The orphanage gone? The kids split up, sent to who knows where, and Oliver, his chest squeezed tight, breath hitching. He needed to fix this. He needed a plan. The next few days passed in a blur of phone calls and paperwork, Jack's head spinning with numbers and forms and the tight-lipped voices of caseworkers who had too many problems and not enough time. Every door slammed shut before he could get a foot in. Every call ended with the same worn-out words. "No funds, no options, nothing we can do." Jack's temper frayed raw. He barely slept, pacing the length of his apartment until the shadows grew long and cold, until the dark pressed in too tight and he ended up in his truck, headlights cutting through the early morning fog. Oliver didn't ask, but Jack caught the way the kid's eyes followed him, wide and worried, shoulders hunched tight when Mrs. Carter passed by with dark circles under her eyes. The other kids started whispering, glancing nervously at the grown-ups, voices hushed and scared. The worst was the nights. Oliver's voice would break the quiet, small and cracked in the dark. "Uncle Jack?" Jack would grumble a reply, but his voice always came out too soft. He'd settle on the edge of the bed, The quilt pulled up to Oliver's chin, fingers small and trembling when they curled around Jack's sleeve. "Are we gonna have to leave?" Oliver asked one night, voice muffled in the blanket. Jack's jaw tightened. He stared at the dark hallway, the crayon drawings taped to the walls. "I'm working on it," he muttered. "Don't worry, kid." Oliver's breath came slow and shaky. "Okay," he mumbled, but the way his fingers stayed tight around Jack's sleeves said he didn't believe it. By the end of the week, Jack was down to one last desperate plan: pull every dollar from his savings, cash out the retirement fund that hadn't even begun to recover from years of patchwork deposits. It wouldn't be enough to save the whole place, but maybe, just maybe, it could be enough for Oliver. The form stared back at him from the table, black and white and cruel. Adoption. Custody. Background checks and inspections and a half-dozen hurdles he'd never clear in time. The knot in his chest twisted tighter. The door creaked behind him, small footsteps padding soft across the kitchen tile. Jack looked up just as Oliver peeked around the doorframe, eyes wide and uncertain. "What are you doing?" Oliver mumbled. Jack's mouth opened, a dozen excuses tangling on his tongue. But before he could say a word, Oliver's eyes flicked to the duffel bag on the chair, half full of clothes and books and the stack of adoption forms crammed under a sweatshirt. The blood drained from Oliver's face, eyes going glassy and wild. "You're leaving?" he choked. Like the others?" Jack shot to his feet, hands raised. "Kid, no, listen, you promised." Oliver's voice cracked, high and broken, small fists clenched at his sides. "You said you wouldn't, you said." The words tangled and fell apart, and Oliver's face crumpled, tears slipping down cheeks flushed red. He backed up a step, eyes wide and shining, and Jack's heart punched against his ribs, breath stuttering out rough and raw. He crossed the room in 2 steps, catching the kid by the shoulders, sinking to one knee to meet his eyes. "I'm not leaving," he rasped. "I swear I just—" His voice broke, fingers curling tight but gentle. "I'm trying to keep you safe, kid. I swear I'm not." Oliver's fists twisted in Jack's jacket, breath hitching. He shoved his face into Jack's chest, shoulders shaking with sobs so small and wrecked that Jack's throat closed up tight. Jack's hand found the back of the kid's head, awkward and uncertain but firm. He stayed there, kneeling on cold tiles, letting Oliver's tears soak into his shirt, letting the kid cling tight and desperate. He mumbled apologies against soft curls, voice cracking on every word, chest aching with guilt and something deeper, something raw and fierce and terrifying. It took forever for Oliver's breath to even out, for the small hands to loosen their grip. Jack eased them both down to sit on the floor, back pressed to the kitchen cabinets, fingers still rubbing slow circles over Oliver's shoulder. He didn't move when the kid's eyes fluttered closed, breath slowing to soft snuffles, face still buried in Jack's jacket. The floor was cold, his back ached, and his throat was raw from words he couldn't find. But he didn't move, not even when the clock chimed 2, not even when his legs went numb. He just held on, breathing slow and careful, whispering broken apologies into dark curls and hoping it was enough. Jack's back ached for 2 days straight after sleeping on the orphanage kitchen floor, but Oliver's smile, when he woke up, made it hard to care. The kid hadn't let go of his sleeve all morning, shuffling around half asleep with bed hair and puffy eyes, one small hand fisted tight in Jack's jacket. Jack grumbled about it under his breath, but he didn't shake the kid off, just squeezed his shoulder gently and ruffled his hair when Mrs. Carter's back was turned. The thought of losing that small, warm weight at his side sent something cold and sharp twisting in Jack's chest. The papers on the kitchen table, the cut funding, the board's tight-lipped decision, they all pressed in, suffocating. So when Mrs. Carter pulled him aside with a tired smile and a hopeless apology, Jack bit back the fear choking his throat and asked her how much it would take to keep the doors open. The number knocked the breath out of him. He stared at the paperwork, at the long string of zeros, and rubbed a hand over his jaw, the knot in his chest pulling tight. "We've got about 2 weeks," Mrs. Carter murmured, her voice small and worn. "After that, I don't." She sighed, twisting the hem of her sleeve. I'm sorry, Jack. Jack grunted, barely hearing her. The noise of the kids in the main hall echoed down the corridor, soft and bright. Oliver's laugh rang out over the others, and Jack's jaw clenched tight. He wasn't letting that happen. Not if there was any way to stop it. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and before he could think twice, Jack pulled it out, thumb stabbing at the screen. The first call went to Benny, then Hank, then the rest of the guys, half a dozen old army buddies with nothing better to do and a soft spot for hard luck stories. The responses were immediate and loud, every single one coming back with some variation of, "What time do you need us?" By that evening, the plan was in motion, haphazard and desperate, but a plan. Jack called in favors, booked the community hall for a weekend fundraiser, and wrote a list of supplies on the back of an old grocery receipt with the pen snagged behind the reception desk. Benny showed up the next day, arms slung around a box of decorations and a grin wide enough to split his face. Hank followed with bags of dollar store prizes and a makeshift Santa suit that looked like it had been through the wash one too many times. The next week passed in a blur of strings of lights, folding tables, and too many rolls of raffle tickets. Jack barely stopped moving long enough to eat, hands smudged with marker and pine sap, boots crunching through snow as he moved boxes from the truck to the hall and back again. The kids buzzed around like excited bees, begging for previews of the games and treats, swarming Jack with questions about Santa and Coco and whether they'd have to go to bed early on fundraiser night. Oliver stuck close, eyes bright and wide, cheeks pink from the cold. Jack tried to play it cool, grumbling about tape that wouldn't stick and wreaths that kept falling off the doors. But the way Oliver's smile stretched made the whole mess of chaos worth every second. The day of the fundraiser dawned bright and cold, breath misting in the air and boots crunching over fresh snow. Jack was already elbow-deep in a tangled mess of twinkle lights when Benny dumped a Santa hat on his head with a wicked grin. Jack cursed, yanking the hat off, but the kids caught sight and immediately started chanting for Santa Jack, until his ears burned and Mrs. Carter's laugh echoed off the rafters. The whole day was a mix of chaos and exhaustion, burned hot dogs, kids tearing through the game booths, Benny trapped under a pile of coats by the photo booth with a look of betrayed horror. Jack barked out orders, grumbled at the frosting in his sleeves, and hoisted no less than 6 kids onto his shoulders for piggyback rides around the raffle tables. Oliver stuck close, grinning wide enough to split his face, small hands tugging at Jack's sleeve every 5 minutes with questions about the games and the prizes and if they really had to go to bed when the movie started. By the time the sun dipped behind the hills, Jack was bone-tired, boots heavy with snow and shoulders aching. The raffle was winding down, kids yawning and curled up with stuffed animals and half-empty cups of cocoa. The community hall glowed with strings of lights and garlands taped crookedly to the windows. And then Mrs. Carter caught his arm, eyes shining, voice breathless and thick. "Jack," she whispered, one hand shaking around a stack of donation envelopes. "We did it." Jack stared at the numbers, breath stuck somewhere between his ribs. The board's goal had been passed by a mile, enough to keep the orphanage open through the year and then some. The relief hit so hard his knees almost buckled. He swallowed, throat tight, and scrubbed a hand over his jaw, eyes burning with something sharp and raw. When he turned around, Oliver was there, small face upturned, eyes wide and hopeful. Jack dropped to one knee, fingers curling tight but gentle around the kid's shoulder, voice rough with exhaustion and something else. "We're not going anywhere," he rasped, voice barely holding steady. "Promise, kid." Oliver's eyes filled, lip trembling. Then he flung his arms around Jack's neck, breath hitching with laughter and tears, small fists clinging tight. Jack's breast shuddered, hands smoothing over soft curls, eyes squeezed shut. The papers were already in the truck, adoption forms, every line filled out and signed, the ink still drying. Jack had filed them 2 days before, hands shaking and chest aching, half terrified that he'd screw it up somehow. He didn't wait until morning. After the kids were tucked into bunks, breasts soft and even, Jack pulled Oliver aside, small hand warm in his, eyes wide and confused. He pulled the papers from his jacket pocket, kneeling down slow and careful, voice rough and uneven. "Got something for you," he muttered, hands trembling a little as he unfolded the envelope. "Thought you might. You know. Want to stick around a while." Oliver stared at the papers, then at Jack, mouth open, eyes shining, small hands trembling. "You mean?" His breath hitched. "Like forever?" Jack's throat ached. He grunted, voice cracking. "Yeah, kid. Forever." The breath left Oliver in a broken laugh, tears slipping down his cheeks, and he flung himself forward with a choked sob, arms around Jack's neck, face pressed into his shoulder. "I knew you'd come back," he whispered, voice shaking and thick with tears. "I knew it." Jack's eyes burned, chest tight and aching, arms wrapping around the kid and holding on tight. He squeezed his eyes shut, voice raw and cracked. "Not going anywhere," he mumbled. "Promise." The hall glowed soft with lights, shadows warm and steady, and for the first time in years, Jack let himself believe it. Morning light slanted through the kitchen window, soft and golden, warming the linoleum floor. Jack squinted blearily at the stove, spatula in hand, and swore under his breath when the pancakes sizzled a little too dark around the edges. The smoke detector let out a half-hearted beep before Jack thumped it with a broom handle, muttering about useless plastic and smoke alarms that didn't know the difference between breakfast and a house fire. Oliver peeked around the corner, nose twitching at the smell of slightly burned batter. "Are they supposed to be that brown?" he asked, lips twitching. Jack shot him a look, scraping the less charred ones onto a plate. "They're rustic," he grumbled. "Eat 'em before they get cold." Oliver giggled, dragging himself up onto the stool with a grin, and Jack huffed but couldn't quite smother the warmth curling in his chest. Breakfast was messy but warm, plates passed back and forth, syrup dripping sticky down fingers, orange juice sloshing dangerously close to the edge of the table when Oliver tried to pour it himself. Jack grumbled about table manners and rolled eyes, but every time Oliver's giggle broke through, his mouth twitched up at the corners, scowl slipping a little more. They spent the morning at the park, boots crunching through old snow, cheeks pink from the chill. Oliver's mittens were mismatched, one blue, one red, because Jack had bought the wrong pack and pretended it didn't bother him, while Oliver snickered behind his scarf. Jack kept an eye out for ice patches, hands ready to catch Oliver when he skidded too fast down the path. They made a game of hopping over snowdrifts, Oliver's laughter bright and clear in the cold air. Jack grumbled about hyperactive kids and frostbite, but his steps slowed a little, mouth twitching despite himself. Home was warm and a little cluttered, blankets draped over the couch, crayon drawings stuck to the fridge, a half-finished model plane sitting crooked on the coffee table. Jack had given up trying to keep the place tidy weeks ago. The sight of socks trailing from the bedroom to the living room, of books stacked sideways on the shelves, was nice. Like the silence wasn't so sharp anymore. The afternoons were for board games and movies, for Oliver flopping across Jack's lap with popcorn in his hair and wide eyes glued to the TV. Jack grumbled about elbows in his ribs and movies that didn't make sense, but his hand found its way to Oliver's hair, fingers carding slow and soft without thinking. Dinner was a half-burnt lasagna and garlic bread that dripped too much butter. Oliver scraped his plate clean and declared it the best ever, and Jack snorted into his water glass, ears a little warm. Nights were the best. Blanket forts and flashlights, stories told in low murmurs while Oliver burrowed close, head pillowed on Jack's chest. The nightmares came less often now, shadows held back by the soft glow of Christmas lights Oliver refused to take down. Jack still woke sometimes, heart pounding, breath shaky, but a small hand always found his in the dark, fingers curling warm and steady until the fear ebbed away. The folded letter stayed tucked in the drawer by Jack's bed, edges worn soft. Jack smoothed it out sometimes, eyes lingering on the careful scrawl, the hope tucked between every shaky line. He hadn't had the heart to throw it away, maybe never would. Spring came slow and steady, melting snow and green creeping back into the yard. Oliver dragged Jack to every garage sale within 3 blocks, bouncing on his toes and grinning wide whenever Jack grumbled about the prices. They came home with board games missing half the pieces, books with cracked spines, and a cat that Jack swore he hadn't agreed to adopt but ended up feeding every morning anyway. The nightmares eased, days bleeding together soft and warm. Jack stopped keeping track of time, of the weeks and months slipping past. He almost didn't realize the date until Mrs. Carter stopped by with a casserole and a gentle smile, her eyes soft when she glanced at the calendar. Charlie's anniversary. Jack stared at the date, breath catching. The knot in his chest twisted tight, memories crashing heavy and raw, the sand, the screams, Charlie's last smile. Oliver peeked around the corner, eyes wide and questioning, small fingers twisting in his sleeves. "You okay?" he asked, voice small. Jack cleared his throat, swallowed the lump and nodded, voice rough. "Yeah," he muttered, forcing a small grin. "Come on. We're going out." They drove in silence, past bare trees and muddy roads, through the town and out to the quiet cemetery on the hill. Jack's hands flexed on the wheel, jaw tight, heart pounding slow and hard. The sunflowers were bright against the snow, petals a soft yellow that almost seemed to glow in the late light. Jack set them down gently, breath misting in the cold air, eyes fixed on the headstone. He knelt down slow, knees creaking, and pulled the folded letter from his jacket, careful, hands steady, breath shaking just a little. The paper crinkled in his palm, soft and worn from too many nights tucked under pillows. Oliver's small hand slipped into his, fingers warm and sure. Jack squeezed back, throat tight. They stayed like that for a while, just breathing, sun dipping low, wind whispering through the trees. Jack let the silence settle, the guilt twist and fade slow and steady, the weight easing bit by bit. When the sun dipped lower, Oliver's fingers curled tighter, voice soft and hesitant. Can we come back next year?" Jack's breath hitched. His chest ached, but the weight felt lighter, raw but bearable. He squeezed Oliver's hand, voice rough but sure. "Wouldn't miss it, kid." Oliver's face broke into a grin, bright and relieved, eyes shining with something warm and steady. He squeezed Jack's hand back, eyes lingering on the flowers swaying soft in the wind. They walked back slow, boots crunching in the snow, Oliver's small hand warm in Jack's. The shadows stretched long and thin, but Jack's chest felt lighter, breath steady and even. At the truck, Oliver scrambled in with a wide grin, feet kicking in excitement, cheeks pink from the cold. Jack rolled his eyes, ruffled the kid's hair, and climbed in after him, the engine rumbling to life. The road stretched long and open, sky bleeding soft orange, the air warm with the promise of spring. Jack's hand stayed steady on the wheel, eyes fixed ahead, breaths even and sure. Oliver hummed along to the radio, small feet swinging, head resting on Jack's shoulder, eyes fluttering closed. Jack chuckled, soft and warm, and pulled the kid closer, one arm wrapped snug around small shoulders. The folded letter stayed behind, sunflowers swaying in the breeze. The guilt stayed, too, soft and quiet, but no longer heavy enough to choke. For the first time in years, Jack smiled faintly, breath slow and even. The road stretched ahead, open and warm, shadows behind, and home just around the bend. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to leave a like, it really helps out the channel. And if you want more heartwarming and emotional stories like this, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Let me know in the comments what you thought of this one, I'd love to hear your reactions. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.